Dear attendants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you with us today. My name is Gabriela Cuñaxilac. I am the co-coordinator of the Climate Change Working Group of the Financial Markets Commission of Chile, and I will be your host for this conference. On behalf of the Commission, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first climate-related financial risk conference of the Financial Market Commission of Chile. As the first conference on the subject, it revolves around the regulation and supervision of climate-related risks. We wholeheartedly thank the Inter-American Development Bank, the Central Banks and Financial Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, Ngfs, and the British Embassy in Santiago, whose support has made this conference possible. This conference will be held in English. However, there is an option for simultaneous translation to Spanish by changing the language option at the bottom of your panel. The inaugural speech will be delivered by Dr. Solange Berstein, the recently appointed chair of the Financial Market Commission of Chile. Dr. Solange Berstein is a PhD in economics from Boston University, a master in economics from Georgetown University, and a business engineer from the University of Santiago. Between 2006 and 2014, she was superintendent of pensions, after which she was an academic and an advisor to multilateral institutions in financials and pensions matters. From 2017 and before assuming her current position, Dr. Berstein was the head of the Financial Policy Division of the Central Bank of Chile. It is an honor to give the floor to the chair of the Financial Market Commission of Chile, Dr. Solange Berstein.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and welcome everyone. I will switch to Spanish now, so thank you very much. Bueno, buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a nuestra primera conferencia de riesgos relacionados con el clima. El cambio climático es una realidad que ocurre a una velocidad vertiginosa, por lo que la transición hacia una economía sustentable es urgente y necesaria. No obstante, estos fenómenos plantean desafíos sustanciales para la economía y los sistemas financieros a nivel global, y es el caso de Chile también. La tarea de enfrentar el cambio climático requiere de múltiples políticas públicas, que naturalmente recaen en los gobiernos. En el caso de Chile, se han dado pasos significativos para enfrentar el cambio climático, los que han sido reconocidos internacionalmente. Es importante destacar la labor que realiza el Ministerio de Medio Ambiente, en general en estas materias, así como también el Ministerio de Hacienda, que con la Mesa de Finanzas Verdes y su programa de bonos verdes, sociales y sostenibles, ha tenido un rol relevante en el país y en la región. Asimismo, otras instituciones como el Banco Central de Chile y la Superintendencia de Pensiones, al igual que la Comisión para el Mercado Financiero, se encuentran participando activamente en esta mesa de finanzas verdes y han estado jugando un importante rol en estas materias en el marco de sus propias facultades. Y hay implicancias del cambio climático que recaen de lleno en el ámbito de acción de la Comisión. Las pérdidas causadas por cambios en los patrones climáticos de largo plazo y eventos climáticos extremos, es decir, riesgo físico, pueden afectar la capacidad de pago de las empresas y debilitar su posición crediticia, exponiendo al sistema a pérdidas. A su vez, los riesgos derivados de la transición a una economía sostenible pueden implicar menores retornos y mayores costos de capital, lo que también puede traducirse en pérdidas en el sistema financiero. Por otra parte, la incapacidad para detectar y gestionar estos riesgos, tanto físicos como de transición, pueden afectar las valoraciones de los activos financieros, mientras que la falta de divulgación de los riesgos derivados del cambio climático pueden crear distorsiones en los precios en los distintos mercados. En suma, el cambio climático y la transición necesaria para enfrentarlo plantean grandes desafíos tanto para la estabilidad financiera como para la eficiencia, integridad y desarrollo de los mercados financieros, razón por la cual la Comisión para el Mercado Financiero de Chile ha determinado tratar el cambio climático como una prioridad. En 2020, la Comisión publicó su estrategia para enfrentar el cambio climático, la cual estableció 3 objetivos. Primero, promover la divulgación de los riesgos relacionados con el clima. Segundo, promover la integración de los riesgos relacionados con el clima en la gestión de riesgos del sistema financiero. Y tercero, impulsar el desarrollo de un mercado financiero verde. La Comisión ha asignado al cambio climático un rango estratégico y cuenta con un grupo de trabajo, que como nos contaba Gabriel, él es uno de los líderes de ese grupo de trabajo, transversal entre las funciones de la institución a cargo de avanzar en la iniciativa encargada. El objetivo de este grupo es la entrega de recomendaciones a la institución respecto a la forma de abordar e incorporar el cambio climático dentro de las tareas habituales de regulación y supervisión. La Comisión ha dado pasos significativos en la promoción de divulgación adecuada relacionada al clima, tema que es muy relevante, al emitir la norma de carácter general 461, que hizo requerimientos de divulgación obligatorios relacionados con la sostenibilidad. La norma de carácter general 461 incluye la mayoría de las recomendaciones del Grupo de Trabajo para la Divulgación Financiera relacionada al Clima, el TCFD, del Financial Stability Board, a lo que se agrega que Chile fue la primera jurisdicción que hizo obligatorio divulgar los estándares de contabilidad y sostenibilidad de la Value Reporting Foundation, conocidos como los estándares SAS, que a su vez forman parte del nuevo estándar global de divulgación que está siendo desarrollado por el IFRS. La Comisión también ha creado un área especialmente dedicada a la supervisión de la información sobre finanzas sostenibles, la cual debe garantizar la calidad y coherencia de las divulgaciones relacionadas con la sostenibilidad y producir insumos para la supervisión de estas y otras materias. En cuanto a la integración de los riesgos relacionados con el clima en la gestión de riesgos del sistema financiero, la Comisión cuenta con los esfuerzos del grupo de trabajo, quienes se encuentran ejecutando 3 iniciativas de prueba de atención. 2 de ellas están relacionadas con la evaluación del impacto de los riesgos relacionados con el clima en el sector bancario, mientras que el otro evalúa los impactos potenciales para las compañías de seguro, siendo el primero de muchos en nuestros esfuerzos para monitorear los riesgos relacionados con el clima. Adicionalmente, este grupo de trabajo de cambio climático ha elaborado una solicitud de información, una encuesta obligatoria que enviaremos prontamente a las entidades financieras de nuestro perímetro regulatorio para evaluar la madurez de las entidades en la identificación y gestión de riesgos derivados del cambio climático. Esta información será un insumo muy valioso para futuras recomendaciones que este grupo de cambio climático debe entregar al Consejo de la Comisión sobre posibles ajustes a nuestro marco regulatorio y prácticas de supervisión. Todo en línea con las mejores prácticas internacionales y lo que nos refleja la literatura existente. Con respecto a la promoción de mercados financieros verdes, la Comisión, así como otras instituciones, están apoyando activamente al Ministerio de Hacienda en el desarrollo de una taxonomía de actividades económicas sostenibles, que creemos tendrá un efecto significativo en el fomento de las finanzas sostenibles en Chile y una transición hacia una economía sustentable. Los riesgos inminentes asociados al cambio climático y la degradación ambiental son un llamado a la acción para el sistema financiero. Ellos deben evaluar la forma en que gestionan los riesgos y asegurarse de que aprovecharán las muchas oportunidades que abre esta misma transición. Esta conferencia es parte de los esfuerzos de la Comisión para crear conciencia entre las instituciones supervisadas sobre los impactos del cambio climático y los desafíos más amplios que plantean los problemas relacionados con la sostenibilidad. Chile ha adoptado una agenda ambiciosa en estas materias, que incluye un objetivo de neutralidad de carbono legalmente vinculante al 2050, lo que significa que la industria debe actuar ahora para estar preparada para una economía neutral en carbono para ese entonces. Como supervisores financieros, esperamos que las instituciones financieras adapten su gobernanza, estrategias y prácticas de gestión de riesgo y sean capaces, según corresponda, de divulgar de manera clara y coherente. Sabemos que hay muchos desafíos, pero confiamos en que el trabajo metódico, profesional y responsable no solo de la Comisión, sino de todos los actores involucrados en esta gran tarea, así como la industria, permitirá que cada uno de nosotros hagamos nuestro el papel en la transición de nuestra sociedad hacia una economía sostenible. Deseo que entonces que esta conferencia sea un aporte en esa dirección y que tengamos buenas jornadas el día de hoy y mañana. Y muchas gracias a ustedes todos por participar.
We thank the Chair of the Financial Market Commission, Dr. Solange Berstein, for her insightful words. Now, we will listen to a speech by Ms. María Florencia Attademo, the General Manager of the Southern Corn Department of the Inter-American Development Bank.
Buenos días. Es un gusto darles la bienvenida a la primera conferencia de riesgos financieros relacionados con el clima. En primer lugar, me gustaría agradecer a la Comisión para el Mercado Financiero por invitarnos. Es un honor formar parte de este evento como entidad colaboradora. La visión 2025 del Grupo BID está comprometida con una recuperación sostenible e inclusiva de las economías de la región y cataloga la acción climática como una prioridad institucional de nuestra administración. Como ustedes saben, Chile es uno de los países más expuestos a los impactos del cambio climático. Pocas naciones en el mundo sufren tantos desastres naturales como esta, desde terremotos, sequías e inundaciones a incendios forestales cada vez más frecuentes. Frente a este escenario, el gobierno, el sector privado y la sociedad civil ya están trabajando en identificar de manera temprana los diferentes riesgos asociados al cambio climático a fin de mitigarlos y de construir resiliencia. Lo podemos ver, por ejemplo, en la creación de normativas que permiten la prevención, el monitoreo y la evaluación de riesgos financieros derivados del cambio climático que hoy está implementando la Comisión para el Mercado Financiero. Cabe mencionar que Chile es un líder internacional en la reducción de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Fue uno de los primeros países del mundo en comprometerse oficialmente con la carbono neutralidad del Acuerdo de París, una agenda que el país está implementando al reemplazar las centrales de carbón por energía solar y eólica, a la vez que promueve la electromovilidad e impulsa el hidrógeno verde, entre otras acciones. Esta acción climática es necesaria y factible, pero también desafiante. Requerirá de la participación de muchísimos actores públicos y privados. Todos tienen un papel que jugar. En este mismo sentido, el BID ha sido un colaborador en distintas iniciativas para avanzar en una recuperación sostenible. Una de ellas, por ejemplo, es la Mesa Público-Privada de Finanzas Verdes, una colaboración que desde 2019 habilitó diálogos y hojas de ruta para potenciar la sostenibilidad en el sector financiero, así como la suscripción de una declaración conjunta de las autoridades financieras frente al cambio climático y la firma de un acuerdo verde entre el sector público y privado. Esta mesa, con el impulso del Ministerio de Hacienda y la CMF, ha avanzado en una hoja de ruta de la taxonomía, un escenario análisis y un stress testing, para medir y promover la integración de los riesgos asociados al cambio climático y el desarrollo de un mercado financiero verde. El liderazgo de Chile en estos temas es reconocido internacionalmente, por lo que esperamos que esta primera conferencia permita seguir creando oportunidades y fortaleciendo capacidades en torno a la gestión de riesgos financieros relacionados con sostenibilidad. Muchas gracias a todos, les deseo éxitos en esta jornada.
We thank Ms. Attademo for her words and the Inter-American Development Bank for their constant support to the Commission's climate-related endeavors. We will now have the privilege of hearing a keynote speech, specially recorded for the conference by Dr. Sabina Mauderer. Dr. Morterer is a member of the Executive Board of the Deutsche Bundesbank and Vice Chair of the Ngfs. Dr. Mauderer is also a member of the Stock Exchange Experts Commission of the Federal Ministry of Finance, and until 2018 held several senior positions in KfW, the German Development Agency. We will hear now Dr. Mauderer's speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, climate change affects all of us, and we need all hands on deck. Latin America is stepping up efforts to act on climate change, and Chile issued the world's first sovereign sustainability-linked bond, and this is really encouraging. Climate change will have far-reaching impacts on the global economy and, of course, on the global financial system. Thus, it is highly relevant to the work of central banks and supervisors across the world. I will touch upon two questions today. First, how is climate change affecting financial markets? And second, what role do central banks and supervisors play? One thing is certain. Climate change poses risks to financial markets. And let's look at Chile. Chile is facing physical risk in the form of water shortages due to a decade-long drought. And at the same time, Chile has also been hit by floods in the recent past. Both too little and too much water can be a real problem. It can place a burden on agricultural production and consequently on food prices. This specific example is only one out of many. Across the world, extreme weather events will become more frequent because of climate change. Vast patches of land will become unlivable. And this shows heat, drought, floods, hurricanes, and all other physical risks pose a significant threat to our economies and societies. But there are also indirect risks that stem from the transition of our economies towards carbon neutrality. And take Chile again. Chile has great potential for renewable energies. There are excellent conditions to boost solar, water, and wind energy. Chile plans to shut down half of its coal-fired power plants already by 2025. The operators of these power stations face the risk of stranded assets, and the mining industry will have also to adapt the tighter environmental rules. And across the globe, we have to scale back fossil fuels. This means that fossil assets will become stranded assets. The transition can strain oil and gas companies and, of course, also the associated financial institutions. And this shows that climate change directly and indirectly affects macroeconomic variables such as output, potential growth, inflation, and ultimately our GDP and, of course, employment rates. So naturally, central banks must pay close attention to climate-related risk because we are the guardians of price stability and financial stability. This brings me to my second point. What then is our role? What can we do? And the answer is very simple. We do our job. We ensure a resilient financial system and keep prices stable. Our economies and the financial system face substantial changes. The green transformation will require large-scale public and private investments in climate-neutral technology. Healthy financial institutions and stable prices are crucial for long-term investments. So we lay the foundation for the transition towards carbon neutrality. But there's more. Climate change dynamics are non-linear. This means that past certain tipping points, damages might be irreversible. At the same time, the most severe effects of climate change might only materialize in the next decades. So there is a great deal of uncertainty about climate dynamics and the impact of climate change. Well, central banks are in general well positioned to deal with uncertainty. We keep track of how the economy is doing. We are an analytical powerhouse. Our analysis helps policymakers understand the economic impacts of their political decisions. Many central banks worldwide are currently refining their models to reflect climate-related risk. To refine our models, we need good climate data. Without good climate data, our risk matrix will remain inadequate. Disclosure of climate-related data by businesses and financial institutions is crucial to shine a light on climate risk. In the euro area, we are working on these issues. And just last summer, in July, the Eurosystem presented an ambitious action plan on how to integrate climate considerations in our work. As part of this action plan, we, for example, update our models to get a better understanding of climate change effects. We also will introduce climate-related disclosures into our monetary policy operations. And currently, we are running a supervisory climate stress test to check how well banks are prepared. And of course, we'll practice what we preach. We check the exposure of our own balance sheets to climate risk. So, to make a long story short, central banks are catalysts. Through our efforts, we influence the behavior of market participants and enable the transformation. For all these efforts, it is true to say that a problem shared is a problem halved. International cooperation is vital when tackling climate change. So the Network for Greening the Financial System, in short Ngfs, is an excellent forum to share knowledge and best practices. It is a network of now 110 central banks and supervisors. We have grown into a truly global network, and we are much more than a talking shop. So this conference is hosted and supported by Ngfs members. This is a case in point for connecting and cooperating on climate change. And in this spirit of cooperation, I wish you an insightful discussion. I'm sure that this conference will provide new perspective, fresh ideas, and food for thoughts. Climate change is here to stay. And please, if you only remember one sentence, it hopefully is the last sentence. The less we do today, the more we have to do tomorrow. So let's do more today.
We're grateful for the efforts made by Dr. Sabina Mauderer to record this speech, which is a testament to Ngfs's commitment to these matters. We thank the Ngfs and the Ngfs Secretariat for supporting the Commission during the past 3 years in our path in developing our climate-related risk agenda, and also for all their support in the organization of this conference. After the inaugural speeches that we have had in our conference, we will move to our next presentation. But just before, we will do a little housekeeping. As we said before, this conference has an interpretation option for simultaneous translation to Spanish, which you can access by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom right of your panel. Also, if you have any question during the presentation, please type them into the chat box. We will make our best effort to bring them to our distinguished guests. Now, without further ado, we will turn over to our next presentation, titled Climate-Related Risks, Supervision Challenges. And with us, we have a superb presenter, Ms. Carine Bastos. Carine is a deputy advisor at the Central Bank of Brazil, which she joined in 2010 after 12 years of working in the private sector. Within the Central Bank of Brazil, Carine has been assigned different positions in the supervision area, and she has contributed to the Financial System Monitoring Department, the Banking Supervision Department, and the Strategic Management and Specialized Supervision Department. She currently holds the position of advisor to the head of ESG Prudential Supervision. And in that capacity, Carine is a member of the Ngfs Supervision and Microprudential Practices Workstream. She recently led the work on the Ngfs Progress Report on the Guide for Supervisors, published in October 2021. We could hardly have a more indicated person to present these matters. Carine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for this very kind introduction. Before I start my presentation, let me just try to share my screen with you. So yes, my name is Carine Bastos. I am very honored to be here at this event, especially as a Latin American. I'm feeling so close to home. Unfortunately, it's an online event. I wish I could be at Chile. I am very proud to have a neighbor country hosting this conference. So thank you very much for giving me this honor and the opportunity to bring a perspective both from a Brazilian point of view and also as a team lead to the Ngfs Progress Report. And for the next 40 minutes or so, I was asked to discuss the challenges that we face as supervisors, but I want to also bring what we have done in the past 3 years, and especially what we are doing to overcome these challenges that we face. So before I start talking about the Ngfs guide and the progress report, I would like to give just a brief overview of the Brazilian regulatory landscape. Some of you may not know, but the concern with sustainability issues is not new to BCB. We have been taking actions over the last 2 decades, trying to scale up our sustainability regulatory and supervisory framework. And there are several reasons for that, and I will mention the 2 most obvious ones. We are very dependent upon our natural resources in Brazil, also agriculture, and we are home to the largest rainforest in the world, which represents roughly 45% of our country's territory. So the environment overall is a huge resource, but also a great concern for us as regulators and supervisors. I want to highlight 3 important milestones on this journey. The first one was in 2014. I believe BCB was probably the first regulator to publish a resolution that required financial institutions or supervised institutions to develop and disclaim a policy for social environmental responsibility. Then in 2017, we included social environmental risks in our integrated management resolution, requiring that financial institutions identify, assess, monitor, report, and manage all material risks, including social environmental ones. And more recently, in 2020, BCB decided to include the sustainability dimension on its strategic agenda. Well, when we did that, we had 5 big goals, and one of which is to ensure within the Brazilian financial system proper management of social, environmental, and climate-related risks. And one of the means to achieve these goals was engaging in partnerships and associations, and therefore one of the first steps that BCB took was joining the Network for Greening the Financial System. So Sabine has already spoken a bit about the Ngfs, but if any of you is not yet familiar with the Network for Greening the Financial System, it defines itself as the coalition of the willing. It is a consensus-based forum whose purpose is to share best practices, contribute to the development of climate-related and environmental risks management in the financial sector, and mobilize mainstream finance to support the transition towards a sustainable economy. As she mentioned, the NGFS started in 2017 with only 8 members. And I have a more updated number. She mentioned on her video that the NGFS has 110 members. As of today, we have 114 members and 18 observers, including the BCBS, the IOSCO, the FSB, the IMF, the World Bank. And in my opinion, this indicates that central bankers and supervisors are taking steps towards a greener financial system. And the first one is showing their commitment and engagement. But we have already seen Sabine and Solange talk a little bit about this. Why are we all here? I believe we have almost 400 people in this conference. Why are we so concerned about climate-related risks? Well, the NGFS, the BIS, and several international bodies already acknowledge that climate-related risks are a source of financial risks. And as Sabine said, we have to do our job because dealing with these risks is at the core of our mandate. If you are familiar with the NGFS reports, the first recommendation made by the NGFS on its comprehensive report called us supervisors for integrating climate-related risks into financial stability monitoring and micro supervision. So to help us do that, the NGFS has 5 work streams. As I mentioned at the beginning, I am a member of the work stream 1 that deals with prudential supervision. And the objective of work stream 1 is to track supervisory practices within the financial industry, identify the leading ones, and issue guidance to help supervisors to incorporate climate-related and environmental risks within our mandates framework. So I will base my presentation today on 2 reports that were published by the Workstream 1. The first of them is the Guide for Supervisors. It was published in May of 2020, so exactly 2 years ago. And the guide set out 5 recommendations for prudential supervisors to better integrate climate-related and environmental risks into our work. The guide focused on banks and insurance supervisors, but for instance, we at the central bank, we also supervise other financial players. So there is relevant content for other supervisors, regulators, and even for financial institutions. In the guide, the recommendations are illustrated with practices from supervisors from all over the world. And we did the same later at the progress report. And it's important to say that these recommendations are non-binding. The aim of the NGFS was to offer inspiration needed to accelerate our efforts in the area, but at the same time, given flexibility to accommodate specific needs and tailor actions to our mandates, making progress at our own pace as we can. Following the guide on supervisors, last year we published the progress report, which I mentioned I had the honor to lead the team of 26 institutions that worked to draft this report. And our main goals were to use the 5 recommendations as a reference and take the progress made by NGFS supervisors since the first survey that was conducted in 2019. The second goal was to identify common challenges faced by supervisors, because these challenges allowed us to provide updated and more granular guidance and try to support them with case studies. And on the progress report, we also provide a deeper dive into some areas that were covered in less depth on the guide, specifically environmental risks, which I'm not going to talk about here today, but if you are interested on broader environmental risks, we have lots of material on the progress report. And we also bring a special chapter on disclosures. We based the progress report on 2 stock takes, with the last one on the recommendations. We had 70% of Ngfs who were supervisors at the time answering to the survey. So it's very representative of what we had as when we surveyed them at the beginning of last year. So what I'll try to do this is balance these 2 reports. I will bring the recommendations and then the most cited challenges, and I'll try to give some key takeaways of what supervisors have been doing to overcome these challenges. Starting with recommendation 1, the Ngfs calls upon supervisors to determine how climate-related and environmental risks transmit to our economies and to our financial sectors, and then identify the risks that are likely to be material for our supervised entities. So before meaningful policies are enacted, we are invited to do the work to understand the ways, the specific ways that climate-related and other broader environmental risks can impact our national economies. Before I move forward with the presentation, it is very important that we have the same definitions in mind, because the Ngfs in the guide and the progress report defines this type of risks from a prudential perspective. So climate risks are considered financial risks posed by the exposures of financial institutions to physical or transition risks caused by or related to climate change. Physical risks are then defined as the economic costs of financial losses resulting from the increase in severity and frequency of extreme climate change related weather events, as well as longer-term progressive shifts in climate. These weather events could be, for example, heat waves, droughts, landslides, floods, wildfires, storms, ocean acidification, rising sea levels, and rising average temperatures. Transition risks, on the other hand, impact financial institutions through the process of adjustment towards a lower carbon and more circular economy. And this could be prompted, for example, by changes in climate and environmental policy, technology, or market sentiment. Broader environmental risks are those that arise from exposures to activities that may cause or may be affected by environmental degradation and the loss of ecosystem services. And at this point, you have probably realized that there is a connection and to some degree, great overlap between climate-related and environmental risks. As we know, climate change can lead to environmental degradation. However, some sources of environmental degradation are not related to climate change, such as air pollution. And this is the reason why we have tried to make the transmission channels and of environmental risks more clear in the progress report. Other examples of environmental degradation are air pollution, scarcity of fresh water, land contamination, desertification, biodiversity loss, and something that unfortunately we are familiar with in Brazil, deforestation. So on the guides, besides starting with these definitions, recommendation 1 explores the transmission channels through which climate change can impact the economy and the financial system. There seems to be a consensus that traditional risk categories like credit risk, market risk, liquidity, operational risk, they can be used to capture climate-related risks. But it ultimately falls on national supervisors to understand the channels which may be more or less relevant in each jurisdiction, given geographic exposures and even the political dynamics. So now, with the stock take that the progress report brings, when we surveyed supervisors, most of them said that they have already implemented or are in the process of implementing climate-related risk assessment. I'm not going to talk about the lower bar because this is specifically for broader environmental risks, but just one key takeaway from the progress report: when we take exclusively environmental, it is compared to climate risks at a very early stages. So progress is a lot less advanced in broader environmental risks. But this is just an observation because I'm not going to talk about this in this presentation. So moving to the challenge side, progress is hampered in particular by data gaps. And by data gaps, I mean the limited availability of data and quality of data. And supervisors state that this affects the comparability and the reliability of climate-related risk analysis. There are also limitations in existing methodologies, especially to cater for the longer time horizon required for this type of risk assessments, and to factor in the unique characteristics of these risks, whereas we know historical data are not a very good guide to determine future risks. Some of the key takeaways is that using adequate definitions and categories of climate-related risks already helps to start addressing them. So on the progress report, we bring definitions from the Ngfs and various international and regional initiatives that are trying to help supervisors to categorize risks in a consistent manner. Another key takeaway is that a multidisciplinary approach is very useful to leverage the required expertise, because we are used to dealing with traditional risks, but when we are talking about climate-related risks, know-how is not always available in-house. So some authorities are leveraging on external stakeholders that are not directly connected to the supervisory community. And by this, I mean scholars, climate scientists, NGOs, and so on. And we recognize that understanding environmental risks is at a very early stage compared to climate. But on the progress report, we try to bring some knowledge that is already available, especially regarding transmission channels for environmental risks, and some recent work that were conducted by, for example, the Ngfs workstream on research and Inspire on biodiversity and other nature-related risks in particular. Moving to recommendation 2, the Ngfs calls supervisors to work inside. By this, I mean to develop a clear strategy, establish an internal organization, allocate adequate resources to address climate-related risks. And the main message here is that we cannot expect the institutions that we oversee to measure and manage their climate-related risk exposures without first integrating these risks into our own work, including training staff members on the threat climate events pose to financial institutions. So this is the recommendations that supervisors have progressed the most. 89% of them have already implemented or have started to implement this recommendation, but there are still some challenges. One common challenge is the lack of internal capacity and resources, and supervisors mention funding, headcount, and a lack of expertise as limiting factors to advance more in the implementation of this recommendation. Other challenges cited were the need for coordination, both internally inside the supervisor corporation and with other domestic stakeholders, but they also mentioned the lack of international standards and coordination as a limiting factor. So the key takeaways: our prudential or financial stability mandates already allow us for incorporating climate-related risks into our strategies, but we have seen that the scope of strategy may vary depending on the jurisdiction. We have seen some supervisors adopting a climate-first approach. Other supervisors, like ourselves in Brazil, adopted a broader environmental and social approach. And other supervisors are adopting a more holistic approach, considering ESG factors as in a holistic manner. Another key takeaway is that there are various possibilities to embed this into our organizations, but we need to keep in mind that we need to start somewhere. So even the organization model that we choose and the resources that we have to allocate to these activities, they may evolve over time. So in the progress report, we bring examples of supervisors that have started very small and today have entire units dedicated to climate-related financial risks. We also have key success factors as capacity building, raising awareness, and there are several ways to address this, but I would like to mention the last one in the slide, which is the Climate Training Alliance. It's another initiative by the Ngfs, which I participate in. It is, the Climate Training Alliance is an initiative from the Ngfs, the FSI, and amongst others. I think the IAS is always involved in this. And the aim is to enhance the availability of training resources for authorities responding to these kinds of threats. And if you have not yet seen our program, I believe that as of early June, we will be launching a series of 5 new webinars to address all these recommendations from the guide and the results from the progress report. So moving to recommendation 3, it is to identify and measure the determinants of physical and transition risks in our jurisdiction, and then assess the potential losses should these risks materialize. And this is different from recommendation 1. I think I could say that recommendation 1 is a macro level, and this is more granular at a very micro level. And the reason for this is because different jurisdictions experience different sources of climate risks. So it is very important that supervisors understand and determine which specific sources of risks are relevant and material, because if the size of these risks will depend on the structure of the economics financial system and the exposure to climate sensitive sectors, even geographic location of collateral and physical assets. So the Ngfs guide describes the process to conduct a complete system-wide assessment of exposures and the 3 phases that it could include. But we conducted a survey amongst our members, and we found out that it takes up to a year, an entire year, for a dedicated team with senior management support to complete this type of system-wide assessment of exposure. So I am here, I'm very optimistic, but I'm not here to say this is an easy task or something that will be done easily in a month, 2, or even a year. So this is one of the reasons why this is the last advanced recommendation. I would say that this is probably the toughest one to implement, and it could be endless. The more we advance, the more assessment we have to do. Nonetheless, 67% of our respondents have included climate-related risks in their supervisory activities in one form or another. But as I said, only a few have conducted a complete system-wide assessment of exposures. And as I said, here the challenges are proportional to the size of the task. We know that data availability is a key element for developing risk assessment approaches. And the precise measurement of these risks is hindered by the lack of reliable and granular data. And while such data is becoming available, this should be the good news, but it is still often very fragmented or not directly usable and unavailable to supervisors. So besides that, supervisors also mention a lack of harmonized methodologies, indicators, and metrics to assess climate-related risks, including methodologies for forward-looking assessments. So some key takeaways: we understand that progress is hampered by data gaps. Nonetheless, there are several initiatives focusing at bridging data gaps. For example, the Ngfs work stream on bridging data gaps. There is also something being done by the FSB. So what we have seen is that there is strong international cooperation aiming at bridging data gaps. It's not going to happen quickly, but we see that supervisors and international setters are working hard to advance at this. And despite that, depending on data availability and quality that they have in hands, supervisor should consider using a combination of qualitative and quantitative tools for risk assessment. So at early stages, supervisors have resorted to conducting qualitative assessment, which do not require lots of data gathering. When we move towards quantitative methods, exposure analysis is the most commonly used method to identify and quantify the potential exposures to climate-related risks. And we see that this happens both at the individual financial institutional level and at the banking level, the banking sector level. Supervisors have adopted approaches with different degrees of sophistication, sometimes using available tools. For example, Sweden used PACTA, but we have to keep in mind that the more granular our approach, it will typically require larger amounts of balance sheet and climate-related data. So when we are planning our assessment process, the 3 phases, we, of course, should be ambitious, but realistic about what type of data we have and what kind of assessment we should design and develop. So the features of climate-related and environmental risks, as I've said earlier, they call for the development of forward-looking methodologies. And we've seen that supervisors typically turn to scenario analysis and stress testing. But currently, most scenario analysis focus either on transition risks or physical risks, because it has proven to be very complex to conduct combined integrated scenario. But a number of supervisors have projects underway to undertake this type of integrated models. And another thing, so when we talk about scenarios, is the work of the workstream 1, the Ngfs. If you have the opportunity, take a look at the Ngfs scenarios portal. We have designed a framework for supervisors to engage in these forward-looking exercises, and many supervisors have been building on these scenarios to build their own. Like in the progress report, we bring the case study of the ACPR in France. So moving to recommendation 4, supervisors are recommended to clarify to financial institutions what is expected of them. And these expectations can take multiple forms depending on the supervisor's jurisdiction. They could be published in policy, through guidance, or even good practices identified at financial firms. And the guide will bring some information on the process of developing these expectations, the risk frameworks that could be used, the concern that we have with granularity, but also proportionality and risk profile. And the guide also brings some activities to follow up the publication of supervisors' expectations. This is the recommendation where supervisors, the second one where supervisors have progressed the most after internal capacity and strategy and structure. We have 83% of supervisors telling us that they have developed or are developing supervisory expectations for climate-related risks. But they still mention challenges. In addition to limited resources, capacity, and expertise that were the challenges for recommendation 2, they also mention the lack of a globally agreed standard or guidelines as one of the main challenges for them when designing and implementing their supervisory expectations. Some key takeaways. What we've seen so far is that supervisory expectations vary a lot in terms of granularity, but they tend to converge to 5 key topics in alignment with the Ngfs guide. And these topics are governance, business strategy, risk management, forward-looking methodologies, and disclosure. Another key takeaway is that when developing their expectations, supervisors have always stated that they benefit a lot from engaging with other stakeholders and taking into account proportionality and making clear in their expectations how they relate to the existing prudential framework that is already in place. And well, developing supervisory assessment programs with an adequate level of granularity is useful to promote adequate risk management. So although supervisors have employed different approaches, such as engaging in dialogues, requesting self-assessment, conducting the assessment themselves, writing a handbook for supervisors to have the same level of assessment. Well, what we've seen is that even with this must be seen as an iterative process that feeds into each other. So you can start with very high level expectations, and then when you assess what your supervised entities are starting to implement, you start to increasing the granularity of your expectations. These have proven to be something that worked for several supervisors. Well, to complement recommendation 4, as I mentioned, when developing supervisors' expectations, there are typically five areas: governance, business strategy, risk management, forward-looking methodologies, and disclosure. So on the progress report, we have a chapter on disclosure. I will speak very briefly about this because I've seen that tomorrow there will be a session specific for this point. But well, supervisors do expect financial institutions to disclose information and metrics on the climate-related risks that they are exposed to, their impact on the safety and soundness of the institution, and how they manage those risks. The Ngfs guide provides some details on the content of such expectations, and this includes the encouragement that these expectations concerning disclosures to be in line with the recommendations of the Task Force on the Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, which was established by the Financial Stability Board. on our survey on disclosures, we found some challenges cited by supervisors. One of them was the fragmentation of disclosure standards, and this is why we recommend that the TCFD is adopted at least as a reference or an inspiration. And also we have seen that the application of different materiality lenses are sometimes a challenge. So I will try to summarize the key considerations on disclosure of the progress report. And this is that supervisors are expected to contribute to mitigating fragmentation and improving the consistency, the comparability, and the reliability of climate-related and environmental disclosures. So I'm trying to keep track of my time here. Recommendation 5 urges us to ensure adequate management of climate-related and environmental risks by financial institutions. And it says that we should take mitigating actions when we find that they are appropriate. So this means we must use the tools we have at our disposal to ensure that firms abide by our expectations. So about these supervisory measures, what are these tools? We have qualitative and quantitative measures that can be taken by supervisors to mitigate shortcomings concerning climate-related risk management by their supervised entities. These measures include discussing findings with the board of directors, requiring board follow-up, requiring strengthened risk management, strengthen internal controls, requiring institutions to reduce the level of risk, and even limiting the distribution of profits. Well, when we compared recommendation 5 to 4, supervisors have made less progress in effectively integrating these risks into their set of formal and binding supervisory tools than on setting supervisors' expectations. Well, although no supervisor considers to have fully implemented recommendation 5, 48% of them report ongoing actions and 32% have plans to do so. Well, the challenges here would be the lack of globally agreed standards or guidelines again. And supervisors also mention again data and methodological gaps, as well as the lack of evidence of risk differentials between green and non-green assets. There will be a report to be published soon by the Workstream 1 on risk differentials. And my last slide, the key takeaways. In response to these challenges, I will mention the key takeaways for recommendation 5. The first one is that international standard setting bodies like the BCBS have been conducting work to integrate climate-related risk into the supervisory framework that we have today. And they are explaining how existing principles may apply in the context of climate change. So we recognize that supervisors have made limited progress in integrating these risks into binding supervisory tools, especially quantitative ones. So let me try to break this down a little bit. Work on incorporating a Pillar 1 treatment for climate-related risks in the prudential framework remains at very, very, very early stages, as jurisdictions are still waiting for international standard setters to advance their work first. And we recognize that there are specific quantification challenges due to the nature of these risks, which are nonlinear and usually span longer than the 1-year time horizon captured by Pillar 1 treatment. So these quantification challenges mean supervisors have not yet imposed additional capital or solvency requirements specifically linked to climate-related and environmental risks. But financial institutions should be required to take actions to mitigate any particular vulnerabilities that we detect, including related to these risks. And if these vulnerabilities are not addressed, we can impose prudential objectives on financial institutions and ask them, for example, to set out action plans. So on this regard, what we have been seeing is that supervisory efforts have mostly focused on enhancing Pillar 2 tools. Some supervisors are considering how to integrate these risks into their supervisory review process. And the ICAP has always been seen as a very useful tool and increasingly mentioned in supervisory expectations. For instance, Brazil requires that these risks are mentioned in ICAP. The Monetary Authority of Singapore does the same. And regarding scenario analysis and stress tests, as I said earlier, they have not been primarily focused on quantifying possible capital needs, but they have rather been conducted for awareness raising or other qualitative purpose. We recognize that these tools need to be developed further before supervisors can integrate them into the supervisory review process and leverage them to take binding mitigation measures. And last but not least, improved Pillar 3 disclosures are key for attaining the transparency required for market incentives to operate effectively. And some jurisdictions have started issuing Pillar 3 requirements, for example, the EBA and the BCB. And going forward, depending on the progress globally, even the Basel Committee could consider articulating Pillar 3 requirements for climate-related financial risks. That was my last slide. I know I had to speak very quick, but I had lots of content to share. I will stop my screen here now, if I can, and then we can go to Q&A.
Carine, many thanks for that presentation. I think that was very thorough. It was a tour de force through this amazing work that you have done in the microprudential workstream at the Ngfs, but also in the Central Bank of Brazil. So we have a bunch of questions that we would like you to answer, both related to your experience in the Central Bank of Brazil and also your experience in the Ngfs. So let us start with this one. How was the development of these issues in the BCBS, in the Central Bank of Brazil? What were the main challenges that you encountered? Like, contrary, as you said, contrary to other supervisors in the region, the Central Bank of Brazil was a pioneer in this. So you had a history before the operation of Ngfs. So how was that?
Yes, if you ask this question to 10 people that work in this area at the central bank, they will spend one entire day speaking about the challenges we faced, unfortunately. I think that the biggest challenge was the first milestone that I mentioned back in 2014, because we faced resistance from the financial industry at a first moment, but we always faced resistance from environmental activists, because even though we were trying to give a huge first step, we had criticism from both sides. So it's trying to balance what would be a good first step at that moment, I think, was the most different part, because as I said, we faced criticism from everywhere. But after we had our resolution at that moment, and financial institutions started to work on their social environmental policy, and when they had to start discussing that internally, I think that was the first great step to start raising awareness among our supervised entities, but also to show to the public that, as I mentioned when I was talking about definitions, the role that we have as supervisors now is from a prudential perspective. So we were not at that point working with, let me try to measure my words. It was not activism. It was about trying to think what we can do in terms of improving risk management practices in the market. So trying to explain the difference from the role from regulator and supervisor to other stakeholders that are regulator as well, like the other ministries that we have. I think I would mention this as the biggest challenge we faced.
Yeah, that's interesting, because basically you were being pushed for not doing enough for one side and meddling in affairs that were not properly included in your legal mandate. So a tricky path forward. Now it seems so clear, right? Like the narrative is pretty straightforward. Like these are risks for the economy. The financial sector may be affected by the economy. Therefore, we need to act. But I guess 4 years ago, it wasn't that clear. Yeah. So, well, the Ngfs has played a role in that, and the report, like the recommendations for supervisors, has been, I think, very influential. And a testament to that is how many of them have taken action in the 5 recommendations you have issued. So most of those recommendations rest on data, but as you said, is one of the main challenges, and especially in our region, where most of the financial industry's debtors and counterparties are not very sophisticated, data is scarce or almost non-existent. So do you think there is another way of moving forward? So maybe, for instance, tools like credit risk provisions for banks or other sort of regulation of that kind?
This is very, very tough question. Is there any other panelists that would like to take this one? Because yes, indeed. I know when I come here and I give all these recommendations, it seems that maybe the Ngfs is suggesting that we have all the tools and all the information that we have to act. But indeed, we identified that the key impediment to risk identification and analysis by financial institutions and by us supervisors is data. So speaking internationally, there are several international initiatives that are aiming to address this, as I mentioned in my presentation. And we have been discussing this a lot at the workstream 1. So how could us supervisors take steps at our level to address data availability issues, trying to enhance quantitative assessments, even if it's at a later stage. So some of the things you mentioned, credit risk provisions, right, at your question, but some of very early stage things that we have been talking about is, for example, issuing regulation requiring institutions to gather and report information, geolocated data that could improve physical risk assessments, or if we talk about transition risk assessment, if they could gather and disclose, for example, the energy efficiency of their real estate exposures. This would help when trying to assess transition risks. I think that we have a long way to go. I don't have, as I said, I'm sorry, I don't have one specific measure, but I think that when we try to map what type of information we have and what we are lacking, the first thing that we have realized in the Central Bank of Brazil is that we have tons of information, but we we don't know from where to start, how to use them. In Brazil, we are the, we have our credit bureau, so we are informed of every single credit operation that happens in Brazil. And we know that by taxpayer number, by operation code, by economic sector. So we have all this data. So we cannot say we don't have it, that we don't have enough data, but how do we use this granularity? How do we implement? So yes, too less data is a problem. Too much data is also a problem. I think we are all learning together, and the standard setting bodies, I think, will have a huge part to play on this, but also the Ngfs. So I am happy to be here today representing the Ngfs, and I think that each country that joins the Ngfs helps us learn more and overcome these challenges in the future.
Many thanks for that answer. It wasn't an easy question, but I think you answered brilliantly. And related to precisely the Ngfs, we have had a few questions regarding like accessing the Ngfs, how to benefit from it, how to access training, for instance. Perhaps you can let us know a little bit about that?
Yes, of course, it's my pleasure. Every time I see that the numbers are outdated from the Ngfs membership, it's a great satisfaction from my side. You will have no idea. So regarding training, the Ngfs and the BCBS have, the FSI have this initiative, which if you want to try to access later, it's the Climate Training Alliance. We held last year a series of pilot webinars, but this year we will start to run the real live, let me say like that, but the real series of webinars, and we are joining material related to climate change and environmental risks from lots of supervisors that are members from the Ngfs and also for the FSI. So we are using the FSI platform to hold these webinars and to make the training material available. But there are also lots of information in each of the work streams page. And as I said, regarding scenario analysis, there is one portal specific for that. And they have tutorials and they have case studies. So even supervisors that are not members from the Ngfs can benefit a lot from every publication and all the knowledge that we are acquiring and trying to democratize as Ngfs members.
Carine, many thanks for your answer, and also many thanks for a brilliant presentation. So interesting to hear it also from a Latin American supervisor. It brings hope to all of us who are either going through the process or just starting the process, to see that there's a lot of materials that can be accessed, and also that the Ngfs is open and there's much to get from there. And I think also a good closure would be to, like, one of the takeaways from your presentation is the role of standard setting bodies. So let's hope those principles for financial related, climate related risks will be of influence for other regulators in the region. Carine, many thanks again for your brilliant presentation. And we will now move forward to our coming panel.
Okay, thank you so much again. And I will leave my contact. So even the Central Bank of Brazil or through the ASBA. So if anyone to reach out for us, for me or the Central Bank of Brazil, please feel free. Thank you so much, Gabriel.
Thank you, Carine. Okay, our coming panel is titled From Risks to Market Opportunities, and it will cover how financial markets have been developing products and tools to transition to a sustainable economy while managing risks adequately. This panel will have stellar exponents and will be moderated by Mr. Francisco Demichelis. Francisco is a senior financial markets specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. He has experience as project team leader in financial inclusion, economic opportunities, and credit access through the IDB funding projects. Francisco, we are happy to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Gabriel, for the introduction and for the great opportunity to discuss with our guests these relevant issues. Let me introduce our audience, our distinguished panelists, Mr. Sean Kidney and Mr. Patricio Sepulveda. Sean Kidney is a world-renowned figure in the sustainable finance world. He is the CEO of the Climate Bond Initiative, an international NGO working to mobilize global capital climate action, and is a member of a number of related organizations like the French government Green Sovereign Bond Evaluation Council, the UK government Green GLIT Advisory Committee, the Board of Climate Transition Pathways, the Board of the UNDP Ngfs Climate Aggregation Platform, and the European Commission Platform on Sustainable Finance, among several others instances. In 2016, he was named Environmental Finance Magazine Personality of the Year. And from 2017 to 2018, he was voted Global Capital Magazine Most Influential Champion of the Sustainable Finance Market. In the other side, Patricio Sepulveda is currently the head of the Public Debt Office of the Ministry of Finance, where he has also acted as senior advisor since 2002. Mr. Sepulveda has led a number of groundbreaking milestones in sustainable finance. His team is responsible for the issuance of more than 120 billion of Chilean sovereign debt in the local and international markets. In 2019, his team organized the first Chilean green bond issuance for 2.4 billion, agreed on a framework for future thematic issuances, and for more recently made to the global finance news by issuing the first sovereign sustainability-linked bond of the world. We are honored to have these amazing panelists that will share with us their insight about the main issues in developing sustainable instruments and green finance at a local and global level. Let us start with a global panorama. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francisco. And it's an honor to be here. It's also an honor to be here, Patricio, in your company, because let's face it, Hacienda in Chile is a hero of the green bond and the climate bond and the sustainability linked bond market. The work you've done to show others, that is showing others what to do, the success you've had with this issuance is really a beacon and for what governments need to do around the world in this particular space. Hey, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that the Chilean government's doing enough. No, there's a lot more that the Chilean government can, should, and I think will do, especially in the term of this current government. But it's a fantastic start, and it's been incredibly useful to exercise the imagination of others around Latin America and around the world to get people excited. And you can point to Colombia's issuance because of the Chilean government. You can point to other private sector bodies that are following through. Apart from the fact that any bond market needs government liquidity and benchmark pricing anyway to go in terms of growing a local Chilean market. So it's an honor to be here in your presence, Patricio, representing the issuance of the government. I'm going to talk about what's happening around the world to a certain degree. I do have a PowerPoint, which I will share, if I may, seeing as my team has done a lot of work in presenting it. You know the basics of why we're doing this and what the challenges are and so on. I do want to just remind people about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out very recently, which is a terrifying report. It's a terrifying report in terms of the speed of impacts of climate change that we are seeing. This is no longer a future issue. This is a current issue. The level of increase in temperature year after year after year around the world, the level of climate incidences that are happening in different parts around the world. This is real, and it's not just emerging markets, it's rich countries like the heat dome over British Columbia last year, which saw 50-degree Celsius temperatures in British Columbia. It's supposed to be famous for snow and so on, not to mention floods in China and Germany. And we have to also look at the broader impacts of climate change and understand in the 1600s, we saw global cooling of 2 degrees. Why? We now know, because we managed to kill so many American Indians, the 1500s, through smallpox and measles, that we had massive forestry growth in the Amazon in Central America. From research that Stanford University has done tree rings now, it's very clear that the level of carbon drawdown that came about in those 1500 periods cooled the planet 2 degrees for 100 years. And in that cooling, we had, well, what were the impacts of people? How did people experience the cooling? They experienced it as war, as famine, as pandemics. That's how they experienced it. That is what we are looking at in this century as a result of climate change. We've already had a pandemic. This is a pandemic. Well, let's just say that the IPCC Health Committee had been predicting pandemics for 30 years, and frankly, some people weren't listening. You might remember that Obama set up a pandemic office, Donald Trump dismantled it. Stupido. Clearly, we need to listen to our scientists more, not just about the physical impacts, but about the health impacts that are coming through. And the food impacts we are now experiencing in Europe, a war. What is this war? It is a petrol state dictator using funding from revenues from Europe for buying petrol and gas to finance a war in a country, and leading, of course, to famine. We're seeing a global spike in food prices that is going to become a disaster for many countries over the course of this coming summer. People are not going to be able to afford bread in many parts of the Middle East, for example. These are the means by which we experience climate change. It is not gently rising sea levels in Valparaiso. We need to understand that. So we need to act. Now, all of that is really background for me saying we need to be looking for the Chilean government, like every government in the world, to increase its leadership, to do more in making these changes within the confines of the challenges we have, capital and so on, and the global economic shift. I want to talk about that in a minute. But in terms of green finance, there's a simple thing we're doing with green finance and sustainable finance here, which we have proven with the growth of the green and sustainable bond market, now sitting at about $3 trillion outstanding, including Chile's recent sustainability bond. We have proven that if we do create investments that address climate change and meet risk yield requirements in one form or another, that people, that investors will invest. Subscription rates for these bonds, as Chile has found, have been very high, very successful pricing is consequently as well. So we know the appetite is there, it's real, it's material. We need to deliver more solutions. Of course, that's what we try and do at the Climate Bonds Issue, to support governments and investors around the world to see a wider, larger, bigger capital flows to the right kinds of solutions. The role of regulators in all of this. Well, we know that there's enormous risk associated now with the transitions we're experiencing. In a presentation I did a while ago to the Banco Central de Brazil, my co-presenter was the Bureau of International Settlements, the Financial Stability Institute has been working on the Basel changes. And he presented an outline of the nature of risks that regulators need to address, which was beautiful and succinct. It said there are physical risks being to impact investments, which has a flow-on effect to the financial system and the stability of the financial system. This is the hurricanes, the floods, and of course the pandemics and potentially wars, if you want to link them to climate change, as I have rather overtly done so a minute ago. There's also transition policy risk. Last year at the Biden Climate Summit in Washington, D.C., all the world's major Western economies committed to strong 2030 targets. Very important that, not 2050, not many governments away, but rather 2030 targets within the imagination of existing governments, certainly existing parties. We now have amongst investors globally an absolute certainty that we are going to see change, that the world is changing. The question is not what the shape of the future will be, that is decided, but rather the speed of that change, how quickly we're going to get there. Now, that means a whole lot of things. It means that investors are trying to pick what's going to work now, what the nature of the tsunami of change is going to bring, and how to keep ahead of the things that are going to be problematic, such as stranded investments and so on. And of course, for a regulator, but now in that understanding that the change is certain, what are the impacts for our financial sector, for our global economy likely to be, and how can we invert the negative risks that are represented there? This is now a central part of work, and of course this is why the Network for Greening the Financial System is operating to try and flesh these out. And this is of course one of the things that I have to say, it's been fantastic to see that CMF has been looking at and exploring going forward. The green finance market is simply a tool to mitigate that risk. We certainly see in Europe, in the growth of this market, an appreciation by regulators of the extent to which supporting capital flows to green can be a risk mitigant to the financial stability risk coming through the system that they're concerned about and worried about. And that's why Christine Lagarde has talked so actively about the importance of green quantitative easing going forward. But there are many instruments. My friends at the People's Bank of China have provided a wide range of incentives for green bonds and green finance, such as discount wholesale capital liquidity lending window of the central bank if banks post green bonds as collateral. A simple measure, 1% difference in cost of capital, by the way, which is extremely attractive for banks. There are many benefits that are being rolled out by regulators. Of course, the Reserve Bank of India has now made green bonds eligible, or rather green finance, green lending, part of the public sector finance requirements. So banks are required to lend to different sectors. Well, green is one of those sectors. SEBI, the regulator in India, of course, has had green bond guidelines for many years to try and support and provide some guidance around these things. In many areas, we have these kinds of developments. We've seen the growth organically of a market which has gone way beyond green. The daughters of green bonds include those sustainability bonds, the sustainability linked bonds, SDG, resilience, transition bonds, and so on. This is the $3 trillion market now. It's a market, by the way, that will probably grow 50% in 2022. It'll continue to be fast growing. In the green space, just a few characteristics for everyone. There are some differences in Latin America versus global issuance. We've seen, for example, energy being more dominant in Latin America. Buildings, surprisingly, we've seen little issuance against energy efficient real estate across Latin America. I'm a bit puzzled why. The Santiago real estate market is a vibrant market, and we do have some labeling schemes around. So that's an area we'd like to look into. This is, of course, should be relevant for regulators because property is such a massive asset class. 2/3 of hard assets on the planet are property assets. So the link between green finance, reduced risk of buildings that lower their energy bills and so on, there are palpable material issues here to explore. And you've seen this with some European regulators taking active measures to try and grow a green property bond market. The Hungarian central bank, for example, has brought in risk weighting differentials in the capital ratio requirements of banks if they post green property bonds or the whole green property bonds. So that's an interesting mix or missing element here. We've also haven't seen a lot in the area of agriculture. It's been very little. And we've seen basically nothing, nada, yet in the area of adaptation or resilience. And yet this should be a huge area of issuance and allocation of proceeds in Latin America. We'll be working at the Inter-American Development Bank, our colleagues hosting today, on developing criteria for, or promoting criteria for resilience and adaptation investments going forward to try and encourage that particular change in how we do the market going forward. But in the meantime, we've had some success. You've seen the bonds that have been issued or whatever. I'm not going to go to the details apart from, again, applaud Hacienda for the work that's already done. In terms of issuer diversification, of course, in Chile, the government issuance has dominated things, but it's been very different in other kinds of markets. We would like to see greater diversification across the Latin American market going forward and in the Chilean market going forward. We need to be looking now to how to support issuers who haven't thought about doing something this to come forward. Now, this will be very useful for investors because it'll be a risk mitigation tool. We'll be able to shift funding towards greener investments, which will be lower risk going forward. And when we talk of taxonomies, we've yet to start work on a taxonomy in Chile, of course. Colombia has now rolled out it. The European Commission has. Taxonomies have a really critical role in understanding risk because they represent the lower risk universe going forward. The shopping list of the future represents investments that are less likely or unlikely to be negatively impacted by policy change. So as a result, it's a prized market. That's certainly how it's playing out markets. So a Chilean taxonomy would be a useful way to highlight, clarify, make certain what are the lower risk investments going forward in that particular context and support the growth of a market. We've seen a reasonably large growth, but we need to do a lot more. We have about $30 billion US equivalent of green bonds in the Latin American market and a total of about just under 50 billion for green and social and sustainable markets, with the social and sustainable part growing, which is fantastic. When we look at social and climate bonds, we look at not just social as a good idea, its values. We look at social as a critical part of climate, because in a world of volatile weather, and we are entering into 3 decades of extreme volatility, even if we meet all our climate targets for 2030, we need to ensure our societies are better placed to respond, to bounce back in the face of that volatility. And that involves social investments. So we consider social as climate resilience investments in that context. And in that particular approach, and this is a nod to Hacienda, we are looking at how we expand the single universe to have green, climate resilience, social and adaptation and so on, rather than have different silos going forward. So we can create a large liquid market rather than have separate smaller markets. Because we need to be treating all of these things through, or looking at all these things through a common lens. There are, of course, a bunch of new instruments coming our way. Transition bonds will become a feature in the next couple of years. So will enabling bonds. I've had talks before with different ministries in Santiago about the great plans that Chile's had around lithium mining and supporting it. This is an important enabling investment for the transition to a low carbon economy. It's not necessarily green in its own right, but it's critical to being able to achieve the green. We need to be looking at how we can raise capital for Chile's mining ambitions in these areas through this particular market and link those kinds of investments to achieving our global green ambitions and in a variety of other resource economies as well. So you'll see more of that going forward. We need to be looking at agriculture investments, land use, certainly the climate bonds initiative. This is a major area of work for us at the moment, of sequestration and resilience going forward. Through all this will start appearing in the taxonomy work that is happening in different governments around the world, which are all linked. Very important to note this, by the way. While every country in the world is talking taxonomy, the commonalities are what really count here. The Colombian taxonomy that's been produced is essentially mirroring the European taxonomy and closely linked to the South African taxonomy, and will be very closely linked to the Singaporean taxonomy that we're also working on at the moment. They are using similar approaches, and there is lots of scope for more collaboration for taxonomy. To take mining criteria, for example, one of the things that we've proposed is that the Chilean government's forthcoming or potential future work on taxonomy pick up the issue of developing mining criteria, but do it in concert with other resource heavy economies such as South Africa's and Canada's, and in collaboration or talking with the Chinese and the European taxonomy process. In other words, let's get everyone synchronized up front, but drive the change from those people who know most about what's involved. There's scope to do more on taxonomy in this particular kind of way. There's also scope to bring in more instruments for a regulated perspective. Have we looked enough at short-term debt? Could we be having a large market of certified short-term debt? We've already seen a club bond certified repo in Australia. We've seen commercial paper in Sweden. Let's look at that as well. How much more can we look at the equity discussion so the stock exchanges reflect the low-risk universe of taxonomies more? We're looking at this with entity certification. Chile has already pioneered this course of its SLB as an idea going forward, linked to targets. The question, the trick in all of this is being confident about the nature of the ambition being posed by the issuing entity. So if a company in Mexico does a sustainability linked bond, are we sure that the ambition that's being promoted is adequately ambitious to meet our climate challenges? We need to link this to the NDCs. We need to link this to our understanding at a national level of what's got to be done. There's a bit of work to be done in that particular area. There's plenty of benefits of green bonds. I don't need to be talking to this audience about it. I'm just going to say simply, more investors, more loyal investors, showing off the leadership of institutions, showing off to investors that institutions are tackling the primary risk investors now see going forward, and of course things like some pricing benefit as a collateral issue. I've mentioned the transition idea. This is part of going forward. We'll see more of that this year. I want to talk about the future, really. We need to see some changes or some further work in the LATAM area to grow issuance. We need more issuance. We need more public sector linkages to national development goals. We also need a wider engagement with the banking and finance sector on the back of this kind of issuance. Technical assistance programs, education programs, possibly incentives around it, like the central bank incentives that I mentioned before. Standardized reporting, this is something the Inter-American Development Bank has done some work on, that we've supported them on, a platform for standardized reporting. There's work to be done to grow this, but nothing is as important as the last point. The thing that we have to do, the thing that every economy has to do, is about tackling real economy investments now. How do we change our society? A couple of weeks ago, I had a long conversation with Thomas Anker's Christensen, who's Denmark's climate ambassador. The work that the new government in Denmark is doing is fascinating and interesting. In every single ministry, they now have a working group looking at what that ministry needs to do and what needs to happen in its portfolio around both mitigation and resilience going forward. In other words, it's a government-wide approach to the challenge. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to see the wholesale introduction of punitive laws or here and there. We have to be conscious of things like just transition. We have to be conscious of bringing the people with us. We have to be conscious of building a productive and wealthy economy through this process. But these are not opposed. We can do both things. And because the world is changing quite drastically now, look at the extent of demand for lithium in the last 2 years, where it's going the next few years, and what that means for the Chilean economy. Because these changes are underway, we have an opportunity to craft industrial strategies, to craft manufacturing, employment, skill development strategies, which take advantage of this change coming through. And that's the real job to be done at every government. That's a real opportunity for Chile in terms of this changing global economy. That, of course, is something the regulator, well, needs to support, because all of this will reduce the risk of financial instability going forward, will reduce the risks that we currently are forced to confront. You know, globally, we're going to see more work on definitions. Globally, we're going to see a tilt to green incentive regulatory support of various sorts. But fundamentally, most importantly, we need that rush of asset renovation, of asset creation, not just energy, not just commodities, urban development. What does it look like going forward? What does it mean for regulation, agricultural planning, and all of these things? So I'm going to say, Chile has done a fantastic job. Hacienda, I have to say, full marks. But there is so much more to be done. We look forward, I look forward, our friends at the Inter-American Development Bank look forward to working with you on this revolution in our economy, our society, a revolution that should give us a future that we'll be proud for our children to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for the presentation. Now we're gonna hear to Patricio Sepulveda about his presentation and in a more local perspective. Patricio, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much, Francisco. For the very warm and gentle presentation, and for me it's also an honor to share this panel with Shane. I remember when we began this adventure in 2018. So we have the important support of the IDB, but also CBI. We issued in 2019, and then we haven't stopped. So. It's an honor also for me to be here, and thank you very much to the organizer for the invitation. I will start my presentation with a broad overview of the Chilean situation, and then I will review the contribution of the public debt management strategy to address the climate change and the sustainable growth. Specifically, I will speak about the ESG issuances. So in this slide, you can see that in Chile, we have experienced a significant evolution of pollution from 90s to 2016. The growth of GHG emission grew about 8% per year. And also since 2016, we have managed to curb that growth. It's still about 2%. The pollution from the energy sector, which includes transport, is the one that grew the most. This is the red bar here in the graph. Also, the substantial increase of non-conventional renewable energy since 2015 has been fundamentals. We will see this in the next slide. The other important feature here is in 2017. Sorry, going back to the previous slide here. It's in 2017, the land use and also the forestry, due to the forest fire, was very poor, and the net emission went up about 11 metric tons CO2 equivalent. So this element is very important to take in consideration. So in general, in Chile, we have suffered the effect of global warming. We put here some picture related to the pollution in large cities, water shortage and drought. So if we don't react with concrete measures, this will continue to increase and could get worse. Next slide, please. So, however, we consider that Chile is well committed to face climate change. We have on the regulatory front, we have the law of climate change. Basically, this law seeks to be a legal framework to assign responsibility in reducing the emissions. And also, at the same time, it provides a framework for the implementation of measures to mitigate gas emissions and adapt the country to the impact of climate change, as well as its reporting. This law is very important because this law grants powers and obligation to the states for climate action, establish the goal of carbon neutrality, and make state action more flexible by adjusting measures according to economic, technological, and international advance, among others. We have also the other framework is the energy efficiency law. So this law seeks to be prepared to future scenario, establishing a national scenario or a national energy plan coordinated by the Ministry of Energy. And this plan is focused on basically the industrial, mining, and transport sector with the goal of reducing emission 2% annual. We have also, in terms of the targets and goals, we have the NDC updated in 2020. In this regard, Chile is committed to a gross carbon budget not higher than 1,100 metric tons CO2 equivalents for the period of 2020 to 2030. And also to reach a level of 95 metric tons CO2 equivalent by 2030. And we have also other commitment to reduce at least 25% of black carbon emission by 2030. The recovery of 100,000 native forestry hectares by 2030. To create marine protected areas, etc. And the other target is related to the long-term climate strategy. So we established, Ministry of Environment established in 2021, this strategy, the long-term strategy, which basically consolidates several initiatives led by the different members of the state. Okay. This document presents a long-term vision for Chile and compiles the commitment and contribution in mitigation, adaptation in different sectorial areas, as well as addresses internal coordination issues, cost effectiveness analysis, and its means of implementation and monitoring. On the policy action, we have the long-term energy planification. So we have to publish this every 5 years in order to forecast energy scenario in the context of 30-year projections. We have also the National Electromobility Law. It's an important agenda in our country. And the last one that's very important is the green hydrogen national strategy, because we consider that for Chile is a key element in our decarbonization goals in Chile. We published in 2020 a national strategy which outlines our ambition to develop a competitive green hydrogen industry by 2025, and we expect to become a global markets leader by 2030. To the right-hand side, you can see the first figure, the base scenario for the GHG emission by 2030. You can see that only the electric generation decrease in this base scenario. So indicating that Chile will reach about 107 metric tons of carbon by 2030, missing the target of 95 metric tons established in our NDC. So we have to effectively to make an important effort, and it's a very important challenge to reach this 95 metric ton CO2 equivalent. And we must redouble our joint public and private efforts in order to achieve our goals. Below, I think that it's important here to highlight the key element in this transition process. Basically, the energy markets here focus on the non-conventional renewable energy, which excludes the large-scale hydropower. In 2014, it represents only 9%, and it increased over time to the current 27%. So, and also we expect that it will continue to increase significantly over time, as you can see in the figure here below. Next slide, please. Related to the contribution of the public debt management strategy to address effectively the climate change and sustainable growth, I think that effectively for Chile, the label bond has become fundamentals for financing of Chile, and they are totally incorporated into the general strategy of the debt management. So this is not a testimonial adventure. This is not opportunistic. This is a key element, and since 2018, the Chilean DMO incorporate this objective in order to promote the development of ESG green asset classes, the green, the social, the sustainable, and the sustainability-linked bonds also, for two objectives: to attract foreign investment, and to support the country's sustainable infrastructure needs, but also to diversify our investor base. To the right, you can see that we issued since 2019. In this year, it was about 22% of the flow of new issuances, but we increased over time. In 2020, it was about 43%. In 2021, it was the record. It represented about 65%. And this year, we expect that the ESG issuance will represent about 50% of our issuances. As a result, also at the end of March, it represents all the ESG instruments 29% of the government debt. So additionally, we have taken a leadership in the ESG markets in 2018, being the first country in the Americas to issue green bonds, and recently issuing the first sovereign SLB, and made effectively denote the first ever SLB from a sovereign issuer anywhere in the world. We consider that this transaction opens a new path for other countries to link their funding activity in the capital markets with their ESG commitments. Next slide, please. Related to the different frameworks, so as I mentioned, we began in 2019 with the Green Bond Framework. We update this framework, incorporates the social and sustainable bonds in 2020. We issue for the first time also social bonds in local currency. And then we continue in 2021 with the green bonds, social bond, and sustainable bonds. And recently we published our SLB framework in order to be able to issue this kind of instruments. Next slide, please. In terms of the projects, so first for the green projects, there are all certified by CBI, which is our opinion, provide to the market a high degree of confidence. Since the beginning, Chile has certified about 10.8 billion, mainly in the clean transportation. You can see this on the right-hand side. Also green building, water management, and renewable energy. In 2022, we certified additional portfolio for about 1.7 billion. So we experienced a decrease of the green project that we can certify. And all these categories are fully aligned with the Chile's priority, focused on clean transportation, as I mentioned, and also green building. Related to the social projects, all the projects and the evaluation are aligned with the ICMA recommendation and linked to a particular SDG established by the United Nations. The different sectors are related to, here this is a list, but the support of people with special needs in vulnerable situation, support for low-income families, access to affordable housing, education, food security, etc. Next slide, please. So going to the last transaction of the SLB. So we published the framework in February of this year, which set the guidelines for the issuance of this instrument and are aligned with the SLB principle of ICMA. But going to the rationality to issue this instrument, I think that is very important that we are not planning to substitute the use of proceeds scheme with the traditional open vanilla, with traditional use of proceeds with the sustainable and green bond. So we expect to have a complement instrument in our objective to develop the ESG instrument abroad. So we expect to expand with this instrument and including instruments that do not contemplate a specific use of proceeds in projects, but rather that the financial cost of the instrument, in this case is a coupon step up, depends on our sustainability performance targets are achieved. So as a summary, we consider that it implies that we are aligning our effort to meet the goals. Otherwise, we will have in the future to pay a financial penalty. Okay. So in our case, we decide to establish the SPT based on our NDC commitment. So to achieve an annual GHG emission of 95 metric tons CO2 equivalent by 2030. And the other one is the carbon budget for all the periods. And we include also another SPT related to the generation derived from non-conventional renewable energy source, in this case by 2032, to reach the 60%. So this is a challenging targets. Currently, we have, as I mentioned, about 27% at the end of 2021. On March of this year, we issue this SLB for 2 billion with the maturity of 20 years. And to give you some details, technical details, the coupon step up was calibrated to 12.5 basis point or 25 basis point if one or two SPT are not satisfied. It means that because of the 8-year fully approved payment, it means a potential total penalty of 200 basis points. Okay, so it means an important additional cost for the government. We review all the markets of SLB, especially in the corporate, because the sovereign was not active, and we consider that 200 basis point is on the top of the range, and we consider that it was very well received from the markets. To the below, to the right hand side, you can see the evolution of the book. The maximum demand was about near to be 8 billion. Then when we tied the IPT from the US Treasury plus 200 basis points for about 40 basis points, so the tightening was effectively very important. We experienced a reduction of the order book, but not so important. So we reached a final order book for about 5.75 billion from the maximum of 8 billion. The new issue concession was about 15 basis points, but consider the market environment. When we perform the transaction, we estimate a premium for about 10 basis points. And the participation of SRI investor was very important. We finally allocated about 68% to this kind of investor. Next slide, please. You see that this element, I think that for all the label bond, but in this case is very important, especially the verification process. So the reporting is key element always. In this case, we announce the publication of annual reports, including information on KPI evolution, the progress against the SPTs. For the first one, it will produce biannually, and the second one, it will be produced annually. In terms of the verification process for the KPI one, it will be reviewed and verified by the technical team of experts on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And for the other one, the performance will be reviewed and approved by the Chilean National Electrical Coordinator. So related to the second party opinion, who was a very important process in order to verify first the strength of the different KPIs, and second, the ambitiousness of the SPTs. In our case, the first one was considered very strong, and the other one strong. And related to the ambitiousness, the first one was considered ambitious, and the other one highly ambitious. So I think that for Chile, it was an important result. It was an important and successful transaction, and we expect to continue this jointly with the traditional label bonds. We expect to continue also to issue SLB instrument or SLB bonds. Thank you for the attention. I'm back to you, Francisco.
Thank you, Patricio and Sean, obviously, for both of your presentations. Now we can take, we have a couple of minutes, and so we can take some questions from the public. I will start with Sean. And Sean, in one of the latest climate bond initiative reports, it is noted that Chile is the only country in the region that has issued all three types of bonds: green, sustainable, and social. IDB was part of a couple of them. Why haven't other countries followed Chile's steps? What determines this phenomenon? Is only motivation from the market or the government? What do you think?
Francisco, lack of leadership. Let's call it that. No. I have to be careful here. We have seen some movements, right? We've seen Colombia issue, we've seen Mexico issue sustainability bonds. Just not enough. I mean, I think it's interesting, and Patricio might be able to provide a bit more insight into this. But Hacienda in Chile in 2018 did make a very strong commitment to give it a shot, and it worked. And those first 3 bonds that were issued, green bonds, were very successful and in many ways, notably in terms of drawing attention to what Chile was doing. That kind of flying the flag of climate action. Now, and I think for those reasons, well, I guess, again, talk to Patricio about it, we've had a much deeper level of engagement than we've so far been able to see. But this is changing. Hacienda in Colombia is very committed now to doing more. We are slowly seeing the shift in Hacienda in Mexico. There's some contrary directions in the Mexican government, notably the terrible renewable energy policy of the current government. So there are some difficulties in this mix. But Hacienda is looking at it. In Brazil, the Ministry of Finance is absolutely examining this issue and noting the success Chile's had as part of that. So I guess, like most things, it takes a while for a really good lesson to be learned by everyone else. But there's no doubt that that's happening at the moment. And I think our friends at IADB will tell you that there's a lot of interest around the region in sovereign issuance and other kinds of issuance. I mean, in Peru, for example, we're currently working on a green infrastructure investment opportunities report to try and flush out potential issuance going forward. So there's appetite there and different kind of layers. And so I'm going to say it's happening. It's just slow and slower than we would like. And I think slower than the crisis calls for. And I think that's something we all need to be thinking about in our work. What is it that makes people realize there's a problem, but they don't act on it, including ourselves at different times, right? And I think that's fundamentally the issue. There is no doubt that LATAM as a region has underperformed. I mean, look at the extent to which the Chilean sovereign is overweight in the representation of issuance in the region. It shouldn't be. It should be a cornerstone, but not quite so overweight. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done in the region. So I accept your comment, your implied criticism, to be honest, in that question. And all I would say is I do think this year we're going to see quite a lot of a shift.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean. Definitely. We have received, of course, some requests for the IDB help on this matter. And I will go to Patricio. Pato, this is Chile's green funding developments are truly remarkable, but are mainly public. With your experience issuing abroad, how could the private sector be incentivized to look at sustainable finance for funding on a more extensive level?
Yes, so it was in mute. So I think that for the corporates, taking an example of the sovereign, access to a broad investor base is a key element here in order to take all the effort to develop a framework. Because this is the new trend in the markets. When we visit the investor in Europe and US, inclusive in Asia, we are seeing a very important consideration for all the topics related to the environment. So I think that the trend is that you will see more and more portfolio manager that will have as advisor or a specific team that will make the question related to all these ones. So if we are not prepared with all the question or all the information that the companies, in the case of Chile, it was the country, you will have a very bad situation with the different investors. So to take this innovation and to make all the efforts, that is an opportunity to have more access for a new investor, and also is a way to be updated with the new trend of the market. Okay.
Thank you, Patricio and Sean. In honor of time, of course, we have run out of time. We came to an end of this panel. I would like to once again thank you, Patricio and Sean, for the amazing presentation and your answers. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you, Francisco, for an entertaining and a very relevant moderation of these panels. And of course, we are very grateful to both Patricio and Sean for their wonderful presentations that have surely enriched our understanding of sustainable finance markets, and particularly debt issuance on this field. So this panel has brought us to the end of the first day of the Climate-Related Financial Risk Conference of the Financial Market Commission of Chile. But the conference resumes tomorrow at 9 and will open with a panel titled Institutional and Financial Market Challenges of Climate-Related Risks, with Dr. Robert Batalano from the OECD and Dr. Paul Fisher from the University of Cambridge, and it will be moderated by our Commissioner, Bernardita Piedrabuena. So we hope to see you all together tomorrow, and many thanks again for attending this first day of the conference. Bye.